Right. Super. Good evening and welcome to the Center for East Asian Studies Humanities Colloquium. What? Oh, sorry, I didn't notice that. I'm Fred Dickinson, Director of the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. It's my great pleasure to officially begin our Humanities Colloquium season. We are, of course, in a new era, and although we would have preferred not to have had to confront a global pandemic, we've adapted to the new era in the sense that most of our events in both of our speaker series, in our Humanities Colloquium and in our Issues in Contemporary East Asia Colloquium this year are hybrid. Of course, the one advantage of hybrid is that we can reach a very wide audience. Little did we know when we initially planned the event that our speaker for today, Dr. Michael Szonyi, would bring with him such an international fan club, but it's great to see a good outpouring of support online as well as in-house. Perhaps something to do with your great innovation, the international, what do you call it, the Chinese Studies Virtual Events Clearinghouse, maybe. But for the most part, it's probably your popularity. At any event, we would like to, if you do like what you hear today, we hope that you will tune in again to another Center for East Asian Studies event. We do have 2 more talks in our Humanities Colloquium this term. First, a film studies event next Thursday with Dr. Felix Kim of Chung-Ang University in Seoul, speaking on Bong Joon-ho, the director of the Korean international blockbuster Parasite. And on Thursday, November 18th, we'll have Dr. Meng Zhang, Assistant Professor of History at Vanderbilt University, speaking on edible birds' nests and the cultures of knowledge in early modern China. Okay, so first, let me say something about the rules for our hybrid event. We'll monitor both our in-house questions and our online chat. When we do open for questions after Dr. Szonyi's talk, we'll first turn to our in-house audience, but if you'd like to chime in from the Zoomosphere, please either raise your virtual hand or indicate in the chat box that you have a question. Of course, those of you in the Zoomosphere do have an advantage in that you can already indicate while you're listening to Dr. Szonyi that you do have a question, so you can already establish your rank in the pecking order. So please feel free to start chatting in the chat boxes as soon as you'd like. Okay, well, without further ado, I would like to introduce my colleague who will actually be doing the formal introduction today, and that is Dr. Christopher Atwood. Dr. Atwood, as many of you know, is Professor of Mongolian and Chinese Frontier and Ethnic History in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations. And he's a big fan not only of Mongolia, but also of China and also of Dr. Szonyi's work. So I have asked him to do the formal honors today. Chris, if you would please do that now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fred. It's a great pleasure to introduce Michael Szonyi. Those of you who are a little bit familiar with Hungarian know that an SZ in Hungarian is an S everywhere else, and an S in Hungarian is an SH everywhere else. So Sony, as in the Japanese corporation. He's approved that analogy for his name. Michael Szonyi's research is on social history, particularly of, I guess, the Fujian, Taiwan area. And he just was talking about a program that he's doing, which I think is really characteristic of his research method. Those of you who are familiar with the art of being governed, everyday politics in late Imperial China, know that what it stands out for is he goes really deep dive into the documents, finds things from the Ming Dynasty onwards, and then he also does the ethnography to see how that is what is happening. What happened in those ancient documents and the Ming Dynasty, Qing Dynasty documents can be, and up to the present, can be seen also on the ground in the ethnography. So he's mentioning that another project he's got, in addition to the one that he'll be talking about today, is a work in a Fujian mountain village where there's where he wants to work with the 100,000 land deeds. But the problem is waiting to be able to get access because even he has some of them with him and some of them he needs to look at on site, but he also, without the ethnography, it doesn't make sense. And I think that's a really amazing approach. And I really think that there's a lot of potential for extending that approach to other areas and other provinces in China, but well, he's made such a signature. So today he's going to be talking about Village China, 3 perspectives on modern history of rural China. And this is a work that is intended really to be a kind of work of synthesis for a textbook or a classroom material to really put together some of the advances he's been making in the study of rural China. And he's not going to talk about the Republic and the Maoist period and reform. He's going to talk about something different, a different approach. So without further ado, Michael Szonyi, I should just say Frank Wen-hsiung, professor of Chinese history and the director of Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. I had to get that out.
Thanks very much, Chris and Fred, and to all of you, both here and online, for joining me today. Thank you, by the way, for that great introduction, which is the right mix of past history and forward-looking agenda, as opposed to the usual purely backward-looking introduction. So thank you very much, Chris. The traditional chronology of modern China is typically told as a triptych, or in a form that we can compare to a 3-panel work of art. And in this model, China is made anew twice over the course of the 20th century, in 1949 and again then in 1946. It is extremely convenient to tell the story of Chinese history in this way. It's an extremely convenient ordering device. It actually also matches the way disciplines are organized in universities, both in China and here, but it is an approach that has all kinds of shortcomings and problems. First of all, it rests on the assumption that the only significant or the most significant change is political change. That changes in the political system is the only meaningful change. It also makes it very difficult to account for changes and transformations that extend beyond a single panel in the triptych, beyond a single period. It makes it equally difficult for us to account for and to even to describe continuities, ways in which China was not made anew in 1949 and again in 1976. And it also, as many scholars have pointed out, does not adequately account for personal experience, which is, of course, as a social historian, something that interests me a great deal. Lots of historians over the last 30 years have talked about the need to cross the boundaries, to link the panel. But what I'm trying to do here is a more thoroughgoing revision. So in a sense, this talk is a reflection on alternative ways of telling the story of modern China. I was just remarking to my 2 hosts that you know you've made it when you have an introducer for your introducer. That's an indication of real professional accomplishment. And it occurs to me that another mark of a sense of accomplishment in one's career is that you can come you can be hosted at another university to give a reflection on some ideas that you feel it would be productive to talk through. So that's really what this is. And as Chris pointed out, this is a project that is mainly synthetic. It relies primarily, though not entirely, on previous work by other scholars. And it's a project that was in some ways forced upon me by the pandemic. But I think there is something interesting here, and I hope you'll give me your guidance and your comments. So the inspiration for kind of the format of this talk is the very strong memory that I have of reading Fernand Braudel's work as, I think I probably first read it as an undergrad, but I remember particularly reading it as a beginning graduate student. Some of you probably are having that experience now or can look back on that experience. And what I remember best about that initial reading, it's pretty rare 40 or 35 years on to actually remember your reaction to a book. What I remember best about that book was the notion of the longue durée, of the kind of very slow glacial interaction between the physical environment and human society. But that's not what which I think has actually become much more visible in the history field since then as environmental history has grown. But what I want to talk about, or what I'm taking from Braudel for the purposes of this conversation, is the notion of plural temporalities, that there are different ways in which we trace time, that those different ways of tracing time rely on different types of evidence, that they reveal different kinds of historical change, and that they produce a qualitatively different kind of history. So what I'm going to try to persuade you of in the next 50 minutes or so is that applying this methodological insight, although in a very different way than Braudel ever intended, can perhaps yield some interesting new insight, some counterintuitive findings, some new ways of looking both at China's past, but also China in the present and indeed China's future. I hope that it will be of interest to students and that it will be useful, a work in the classroom. And in fact, that's actually the original inspiration for this project. I've been, as Chris said, tramping around Chinese villages for more than 30 years now, but have never written about that experience, and wanting to have something to share with students about how rural society has changed and followed its own dynamics is the initial inspiration. But that's sort of where the project comes from. So I'm going to talk today about three temporalities, three ways of looking at time. Those of you who know the Braudel book on the Mediterranean will know that one of the brilliant things about Braudel is he's able to isolate the three temporalities and talk about them sequentially. I'm actually not as smart as Braudel. So my version of the story is I'm going to have to go back and forth a little bit. I'm not able to tell the story as cleanly and clearly as he did. The three temporalities I'm going to talk about are the what we might call the long 20th century, the experience of families and communities, and then return to the conventional temporality, which is the temporality of politics and events. By no means does this exhaust the range of temporalities that one could use to talk about the history of rural China. I won't talk at all, for example, about the temporality of human memory. One of the reasons I won't talk about that is because Gail Hirschadder has done such a tremendous job of exploring that temporality. Another temporality that is interesting and may work its way into the book, but not into this talk, is looking at rural China and the Chinese peasant as an intellectual. So we might say the temporality of intellectual history. The ways in which rural China and the Chinese peasant has figured in political debates, what we might call the symbolic work that the peasants. So I'll talk a lot about what the real material work that peasants do, but we could also talk about the symbolic work that peasants have been doing in China for the last 100 years. And one of the reasons I'm comfortable not exploring that today is that Sasha Alexander Day has done a terrific job looking at China from that perspective. I should add, I realize that I'm not sure either Gail or Sasha would agree with how I'm characterizing their work, but I think it does sort of fit into a common pattern. So what I'm going to argue then is that by thinking through these temporalities, we can, first of all, see new continuities, new disruptions, new patterns that we wouldn't otherwise see. I think it helps remind us, or it helps make us aware that the political chronology that is usually central to the classroom experience, and that is what most people know about modern China, doesn't explain the lived experience of the many hundreds of millions of Chinese people who lived in rural areas. And that finally, that the political narrative, while it still matters, while it's still valid, is incomplete. And we can actually understand, and this is why we will come back to the third narrative briefly at the end, we can understand the political narrative much better by attending to these other temporalities. All right, so let's begin with what I'm calling the long 20th century. Those of you who know European history will know that it's not a great use of the term, because when it was coined about Europe, it actually did refer to political events. So I'm going to use the term the longue durée not as Braudel meant it, and long 20th century not as Hobsbawm meant it. But I think it's okay, because the real point I want to make here is that no single human experienced this period. And so we want to talk for a few minutes about continuities and changes over the past 120 years at a scale beyond that which any single human could experience. So let's start with some very simple quantitative measures. The first one is how many people there were living in rural China. I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by living in rural China, or definitional issues in a moment. But the rural population, which for now, just grant me, refers to people living in rural areas and making their living predominantly from agriculture or handicrafts, was about 400 million in 1900. Now, unfortunately, we have to jump right into definitional issues, because the number of the rural population in China there are different ways of thinking about it in 2010 or 20. I don't know why I wrote 2010 there. I think it might have to do with being stymied by Excel. But of the Chinese population of 1.4 billion, the official Chinese government definition says that there are 900 people. Sorry, the Chinese people up to the present day are required at birth to be registered, to have a hukou, and the hukou or huji are divided into urban and rural. The terminology has changed over the decades, but basically that's still true. And 900 million Chinese today have rural household registration. The official Chinese government, so that's the registration system statistic. About 300 million of those are considered by the Chinese government to be out of the village, that these are primarily migrant workers, which if we take that away from 900 million, we get 600 million. The United Nations defines rural person as a person, the UN basically follows my definition, living in a rural area and working in agriculture. And if we go on that definition, we get about 300 million people. I think that an accurate and more comparable number actually lies between 300 and 600 million. Let's just say, for the sake of convenience, that we say 400 million people. And so what this graph, which is pretty simple, the graphs don't get much more simple than this, but what this shows is, to me, the extraordinarily surprising statistic that the number of people who live in rural China and work primarily or significantly in agriculture is virtually unchanged from what it was 120 years ago. To me, that's just, so I'd be quite interested. This to me is just an extraordinarily striking number, but I haven't quite figured out why it strikes me so much. So I'd be very interested I mean, I noticed a couple of you, I can't see any of you on Zoom, unfortunately, but I noticed a couple of you, your eyes pop out. So I'd be curious in the conversation to follow why this is striking to you. Now, of course, I mean, you know that this is not actually an accurate line, right? Because the smoothing function of my limited statistical ability obscures some pretty significant changes. Namely that, well, and I'll mention two. The first, of course, is that rural population as a percentage of urban population has shrunk dramatically from about 80% to under 50%. So that is a real change. It's not a continuity. And then, of course, it's a little more complicated still. If we dive even deeper into the data, the rural population grew dramatically for reasons that I'll talk about in a little while. I have a theory about this from the 1950s to the early 1980s, and then began to drop. But for one thing, this 120-year perspective tells us that, well, first of all, in absolute terms, the peasant problem, right, the challenge of dealing with rural issues, of making rural people equal in their access to resources and in their opportunities, in absolute terms, 120 years of revolutionary change has not had an impact, right? There are still 400 million people confronting the challenges of rural life. It also suggests, in contrast to much official rhetoric today, I mean, 400 million people, that's a big number, right? That's bigger than the population of the United States. It suggests that the rural problem is not simply a residual problem that will, you know, if everything keeps going, will gradually resolve itself. One of the interesting implications of this statistic is that relative to level of income, so we're jumping now just to the present day, relative to level of income, China actually remains quite under-urbanized. So relative to other countries at a similar level of income, more Chinese people are still rural. We could talk about why that is. If you know something about the political history, you know why that is. But what that means, so I think that to turn to a discussion about the future, that has some really big implications for the future. So the fact that the 120 years that have of recent rural history have left China relatively under-urbanized compared to other developing and developed nations is going to be significant for China's development path in the future. And certainly no conversation about Evergrande, no conversation about ghost cities and so on, should not take this into account. And most media accounting doesn't actually, which is sort of obvious, the obvious point to take from this. We can go through a similar range of, we can go through a similar exercise across a range of dimensions. I don't have time to do that, but here are a couple of the ones that I think I will usefully go through. We will find some changes that are, if we do the same kind of simple exercise as I just did, we will find some unambiguously positive changes over 120 years. Chinese people have better health, they are more long-lived, they are more educated, they are more literate. Just a couple of these that I think are particularly interesting. In terms of nutrition, the Chinese diet is significantly richer and more varied than it was 120 years ago. Philip Huang, the very distinguished historian, has argued recently in Chinese, but not in English, curiously, that the diversification of food consumption is actually responsible for a huge proportion of total economic development over the last 40 years. That one of the secrets to rising incomes in rural areas in China is actually that Chinese urbanites and rural people eat better and more varied food. Housing, Chinese people today, in rural areas today, enjoy larger housing. The one sort of interesting complexity, which takes us into the next category, is that Chinese housing, while larger and of better quality, is increasingly uniform. That is, the kinds of housing that people live in rural China increasingly looks the same wherever you go in China. I'm sure anyone, if you spend any time in rural China, you're aware of this. One of the things that means is that rural housing is increasingly environmentally unsound, because all of the ways in which housing used to be environmentally sensitive, built in accord with local conditions, are being eliminated. That is, of course, not China's biggest environmental problem, but it's kind of interesting to think about. So we would then also find some clearly negative changes, and the environment is one good example. The rural China has witnessed terrible environmental degradation, increasing environmental vulnerability. And part of that story, as Stephen Harrell at the University of Washington has shown, is about the elimination of the environmental buffers that traditional society and traditional village life and traditional modes of agriculture built into practice. We would also find, finally, other surprising continuities besides, or to be surprising continuities besides the sheer demographic continuity. Let's look for a second at inequality. there the overall picture really is amazingly continuous. There was lots of urban-rural inequality in 1900, and there is lots of urban-rural inequality today. The places that were relatively poor in 1900 are relatively poor today, almost without exception. Within rural society, the rural society was extremely unequal in 1900. And so we see the same sort of pattern, right? That we can look at the 120-year trend, or we can look at the trends within. Rural society is a good example, looks a lot like the demographics picture, in that rural society became much more equal about the middle of the 20th century and has now become every bit as unequal as it was at the beginning of the period. I'll just point out that I'm not very good with PowerPoint. So a couple of days ago, I thought I would download a bunch of slides making this point. I would find them on the internet and make this point, make all of these points for you. And it proved very difficult. It's because they don't exist. And I think the reason they don't exist is precisely the power of the triptych, right? That in the literature, this is not how scholars are looking at the problem. So eventually, you know, if I said I'm thinking all of this through, if you all agree this is a productive way of thinking, I guess I better make the slides myself. But I think that just it confirms for me that there's something here. For a lot of these themes, there is a distinctive, what we might call sub-cycle in the Maoist period, in which a linear trend is distorted for a decade or so, in particular, of course, by the Great Leap Forward and by the Cultural Revolution. And if you think about it, lots of these themes, I'm not going to show you them all, but you can see how those themes would be, there would be a sub-theme distortion. All right, so we're going to move on beyond the first temporality. But let me first say that I think that thinking about the history of rural China in this way already yields a couple of, to me, quite interesting and even provocative implications. The first is the idea of China's current rise as a response to the century of humiliation. In the framing I've just given you, it is very hard to see China's problems as largely externally driven. I'm not the first person to say that, but I think this is a kind of really, to me, quite a powerful way of demonstrating that. The second, to me, somewhat provocative implication is that at this level of analysis, the story is overwhelmingly one of convergence with global trends. The history of rural China at this level of analysis is largely consonant with world history, though of course the precise timing and the precise sub-patterns vary. But this suggests that one way, if we look at rural China in this temporality, what we see is actually global rural history with Chinese characteristics, rather than a distinctly Chinese story. Okay, so I guess the sort of meta point is that some elements of modern history become newly visible when you isolate this temporality. Let me now move on to the second broad temporality, and basically we're going to go through the same exercise, and the point again is to convince you that we see some new stuff if we look at modern China through the temporality of the experiences of families. So let me now introduce you to the man who will guide us through much of the next part of the story, a fellow called Hoyong Lu, who is, as his children describe him, he's passed away, as his children describe him, an ordinary Shanxi peasant, but also a totally extraordinary Shanxi peasant. And the reason he is extraordinary is that, sorry, it's not a very good slide, is that he kept a diary from 1940 until his death in 2005. So from the age of 9, he kept a diary, not daily, and not all of the diary has been published. One of the things I need to do if and when we can get back to China is go talk to the kids and see if I can get the parts of the diary that haven't been published. He also kept household accounts, every penny that went in and out of his house, or every fund that went in and out of his household. So one of the, I mean, just one of the sort of, for those of you who know the mid-century history, one of the really mind-blowing things is how to see the numbers. Shanxi had terrible hyperinflation in the years leading before, before 1949, and so he at one point he says, well, we needed some cooking oil, so I spent 150,000 yuan on cooking oil, and then the following year his income is 8 yuan total because there's fiscal reform. Anyways, now obviously no one person can represent all rural people, but I think we can still use individuals we can look at how individuals and individual families manifest important commonalities. Let me step back. I don't know how many of you are historians, how many of you write history. I know some of you do. One of the sort of meta questions that I am working through is, so I have this is a truly extraordinary source. And one of the questions I'm working through is whether to write this book as the story of Hoyong Lu, or whether to use Hoyong Lu to tell the story that I'm kind of telling today. I kind of feel like I actually have two books here, but I don't want to write two books. I want to write one book. So that's sort of where, just a kind of classic dilemma that historians face. I'm very much facing it here. So I want to use Hoyong Lu's story to tell you about two continuities that I think are really interesting. The first has to do with the role of the family in rural Chinese society. And the simple version of the story is that despite attacks on the family in intellectual, material, political, social, cultural terms, beginning in the May 4th movement or even earlier, the family has remained tremendously important in rural society over the whole 20th century, but in some very complex ways. The way that I want to focus on here is that throughout the 20th century, a critical factor that has shaped people's experience, people's lives, has not been the historical inequality in wealth or in income of them and their family relative to others, but rather the patterns of the household development cycle. In particular, the household dependency ratio. That's the only technical term you have to learn today. The household dependency ratio is the number of people of working age in your house over the total number of people. So if there's a married couple and she works and he doesn't, that's a 50% ratio. If it's a family of two parents and two kids, two small kids, and only the wife works, that's a 25% ratio, right? Got it. Okay. So what I'm going to do here is actually apply the work of a Soviet economist called Alexander Chayanov to the Chinese case. This is in no way my idea to begin with. Lots of Chinese historians have applied the work of Chayanov to the Chinese case. What's a little different about what I want to do is to apply it across all three periods rather than a single panel of the triptych. And I think if you look at, those of you who are specialists in this area, if you look at the application of Chayanov to the Chinese rural case, the ideas that I just gave you, by the way, that's just a summary of Chayanov. You will find that it's very unusual, and I don't think anyone's ever applied it to the whole period. So the basic argument that I can only give you a sort of brief overview of this part of the argument. What I want to do for this presentation is, for the next few minutes, is to suggest that the structure of your household, the number of working people versus the number of non-working people, was incredibly important, in particular at certain crucial moments of transition. And it was also extremely important continuously over the period, but in different ways. So again, this is just a very abbreviated a couple of examples. This is an example of how the family development cycle and the dependency ratio change over time in the typical family. So to give you an example of how it matters at a critical moment, And I can identify, I think, critical moments before 1949. I can identify critical moments in your middle panel, and I can identify critical moments in the third panel. Is the determination of class ranks in the years around 1949, slightly earlier in the earlier liberated areas, slightly later in the rest of China. As part of the land reform, and I'm just going to assume that there's some basic knowledge here of Chinese history and not tell you what land reform was. But in land, if it's a problem, raise your hand and we can, or put up your hand in Zoom and I can elaborate. But a crucial question in land reform was the classification into class ranks. The work teams, the cadres that were sent down into every village divided the population up into classes. And then that affected how you were treated in land reform, whether your land was confiscated, whether you were given more land, whether you were left alone, and so on. And the critical factor, the overwhelming factor in land reform, as Brian DeMar has shown in his recent book on land reform, was basically how much land your household owned and how much of that land you worked yourself. And what that meant was, if your household dependency ratio was high, if lots of people in your, if the number of people of working age relative to the total number of people was low, you had to hire people to work your land for you because you didn't have enough labor power to work your land. Didn't matter how much land you had. If you didn't have enough labor power to work it, you had to hire people to help you. And this led to some extraordinary distortions in land reform, which the land reform cadres actually noticed, but could not do anything about. So Hoyong Lu did not talk about land reform, or it's not in the published parts of the diary. So here I go to a cadre report from Henan, who points out that the people that they called landlords were landlords not because of their centuries of oppressing the peasants, not because of the brutality that they visited on widows and orphans, as the story is conventionally told, but to a very significant measure because of their household structure at the moment of land reform. And as you know, this had enormous implications for professional opportunities, for educational opportunities for your kids, for the risk that in moments of political tension, you would be identified as a target. So getting labeled as a landlord in 1950 was really bad. And I don't need to elaborate on that. The point is that a big part of what got you labeled as a landlord, this is the extreme case, but the reality is that using the categories of land reform, and there's a whole interesting story about why they did it in this way, but that's not the story that I'm telling. Using the categories by which classes were determined, household structure, and in particular, this household dependency ratio had a huge impact on your life. Let's move forward and talk about the sort of continue. So one could say, well, none of this mattered very long. A decade later, the Great Leap Forward happens. The people's communes are created. There's no more private land anyways. So this problem all goes away, except that it doesn't. It reappears in a way that is significant to people's experience over the whole rest of the collective period and beyond. The simple story, I'm gonna nuance the story a little bit, but for those who don't care to follow the details, the simple story is that the political economy of the commune meant that the structure of your household continued to have a huge impact on your well-being. So it's another way in which the importance of the family is reinforced, even through these political transformations, which ordinarily tell you that, well, this political transformation ends that period and starts that period. So there's three sources of household income, grossly overgeneralizing in the commune period. You make money, your household earns a guaranteed ration, except of course in the Great Leap Forward when the guaranteed ration shrinks to nothing. It earns work points based on the amount of labor you produce. And you can earn income by working on your private plot. These are introduced in the aftermath of the Great Leap Forward. And you get to keep all of that income. So as you know, I mean, I hope I don't have to rehearse the whole story of life on the communes. So people worked really, really hard on the private plots because they earned all of the income from that. Working aged people earned work points. So the number of working age people in your household was crucial to your income from the collective. And so this is a statistical demonstration of what I'm saying, adapted from the work of Li Huayin. But Hoyong Lu, who was at this point not even a brigade cadre, he was a production team cadre. He recognized it, and here's how he wrote about it in his diary in 1962. So one of the things that I just find mind-blowingly cool is that here is this. I mean, he had like 4 years of school. And here he is telling us Chayanovian theory. It's just amazing. Like, I don't know if the other people who've used Chayanov have noticed this, but I'm going to give Hoyong Lu plenty of credit. And I haven't thought about how I'm going to do this, but it's just, to me, this is just extraordinary, and of a piece with my previous work, which has been all about the sophisticated thinking of ordinary Chinese peasants. This is a particularly economic approach to that, but and Hoyong Lu actually goes beyond Chayanov. Well, sorry, I mean, Chayanov, we can't blame Chayanov for not telling the future and not knowing what the commune was going to look like. But work points you get based on how many workers you have. But the private plots from which people derive so much of their income, those are assigned on a per capita basis. And they're reassigned on a per capita basis repeatedly. So if you have more kids, you get a larger private plot. And so what we're seeing at the bottom half of this, this quotation from his diary is actually calculus, right? It's a calculus of household structure relative to income. I don't actually have that in my notes. I just came up with that now, so I hope it is actually a calculus. I think it is. So let's step back for a minute. The guaranteed. Here's another expression of the same point from a peasant saying, which is attested all over China. This is like a suyu that people said all over the place. The collective gave you guaranteed income in the form of a grain ration. And if you wanted disposable income, you got that from working on your private plot. So, stepping back, the guaranteed ration means that the fundamental concern that peasants in rural China, and indeed peasants everywhere, have always had, the fundamental concern: how do you feed your family? In particular, how do you feed your children? That concern was, again, except for the Great Leap Forward, largely resolved. The distribution of private plots incentivized larger families. So one way of looking at this is that the system socialized the costs of a large family, but privatized the benefits of a big family. In other words, this is the system, the political economy of the system incentivized natality, as the Potters recognized long ago, although I don't think they worked out as thoroughly the argument as I have here. If we think about well, you can probably anticipate where I'm going with this. Chinese families in rural China responded to these incentives in the 1960s and 1970s quite sensibly, in exactly ways that we can understand, and that have nothing to do with the patriarchy and son preference. I'm not saying that's not part of it, but we can understand this without talking about Confucianism and the patriline or anything. And that, of course, is what led to the shift in population policy in the next panel of the triptych. So if we return to the first temporality, as I said, I'm not as good as Rudolph. I have to move back and forth. I could have told you this story as an example of the first temporality. Chinese families are smaller than they were 120 years ago. The structure of Chinese families is simpler. This is globally convergent. This is happening with families virtually everywhere, with the exception of a few places like sub-Saharan Africa, but with some distinctive features. In other words, the unintended consequences of the collective economy and the coercive population policies of reform. Helps us understand why population growth led to such a stern reaction. Helps us understand why welfare provision in rural China is such a tough lift today. And I think the main point that I'm trying to make, of course, is that it shows us one way in which the family structure is an element that is continuous throughout this period, despite the ostensible attacks on the family, or the real attacks on the family. So let me just talk very briefly about one other aspect of the second temporality before moving on to the third, which is the nature of rural politics. When rural people in China interact with the state in the village, they interact with people they know. They interact with people they have social relations with. They interact with people they have a history with. If you think about how you interact with the state, whether you are a resident, I'm making certain assumptions about the audience, but when urban people in China today interact with state agents, that is not true. One way of saying this is that rural politics remain to a certain degree uninstitutionalized or informal or even intimate. Another way of saying this is that gray politics still matters enormously in rural China. Here's just one example from the secondary literature, just to speed things along. One example from the secondary literature from the 1950s of how kinship ties affected people's experience with state policy, and with profound consequences for their subsequent experience. Here is an example from the 1980s, to come back to population control, which, I mean, as I've worked a lot on kinship in the past, so I happen to choose these two examples because they were available for the choosing. But another example of how intimate politics has had a profound impact on people's experience. So here, intimate politics having actually a profound impact on intimate relations and intimate questions. It's important to note that the conclusion to draw from all this is not simply that old grudges and old alliances and old friendships got dressed up in revolutionary language. This is a point that Christopher Issett has made quite eloquently. Rather, I think it speaks to the importance of attending to the interaction of the intimacy of politics with revolutionary transformation. Again, one could see this as an example of the long-term temporality, but I put it here because the intimacy of these politics actually, in this case, does arise out of the experiences of an individual. So the social interactions you had with people in your village as a child shape the opportunities and challenges that you face as an adult. And that will remain true so long as the local agents of the state in the village come from the village. There's a big debate in the literature, mostly actually in the political science literature, not the history literature, about continuities in local literature. Continuities in local leadership, whether cadres in the Maoist era are similar to cadres in the Reform era, and so on. I actually think that this is a way to resolve that debate, I think this is a contribution to that debate. Okay, the message, obviously, from these two temporalities, or from attending to these two temporalities, is that there are important continuities, factors that we wouldn't otherwise see if we looked only at the conventional story. What I want to do in just the last few minutes is return to the traditional chronology, return to the temporality of the short term, of political events, the conventional periodization, and suggest that we can now say some new things about it. That this attention to other temporalities can inform our understanding of the conventional temporality. At a certain level, where I'm going with this is probably obvious and at this point self-evident. At a certain level, I kind of hope that's true, because then that suggests that this is a viable argument. Telling the story of 20th century China in rural areas as a series of campaigns, or even as a story of campaigns. So some of the more sensitive literature tells the story as a story of campaigns followed by responses. But even when you do that, I think that's not the whole story. And rural social change, this was the main point I was trying to make in the second temporality, rural social change is not synchronous with political change. It's operating on a different temporality. I think attention to these other temporalities, as I said, also shifts how we look at the conventional temporality. And let me give you two quick examples of that now, just to conclude. So what happened in the years leading up to 1949, and what led to CCP victory, or CPC victory, it's been a contentious debate, well, for 70 years. There was a lot of debate in the 1960s and 70s. The debate has kind of faded a little bit as 1949 is less and less significant as a turning point. But I've been reading the recent PRC literature on this question, and it's really interesting that one of the consensus findings that has been emerging for the last decade or so is that inequality and poverty were not getting worse in the years leading up to 1949. It's not really germane to my talk today, but it is extremely interesting that making that argument has not yet been identified as historical nihilism. When you see that argument about inequality before 1949 as described as historical nihilism, you will know that intellectual life in China is in a really bad state. I mean, it's in a bad state now, but when that step happens, which may, that to me, that'll be a really big marker. Anyways, which suggests that the crisis of the social crisis that led to communist victory was not, as previously understood, a crisis of inequality. Even those who would argue that the story of 1949 is actually a story of the appropriation of nationalism by the communists don't disagree with the idea that inequality and poverty were a terrible factor. But as I'm reading more and more of materials like Hoyong Lu's diary and others, what I think, I've already put up the slide, what I think increasingly 1949 looks like is a crisis of precarity, a general sense of precariousness. The one phrase that one hears over and over again in the oral history is that I could not make a family, or I could not become a family, 成不了家, which we see all up and down, all over China. Here is Hoyong Lu. So Hoyong Lu is a bit maudlin some of the time, but and this is Hoyong Lu at his maudlin worst. He's only about, I don't know, 11 years old at this point, so we can't. This is the very first diary entry, and he's clearly, he's learned the conventions of diary writing, but he's right. This is a crisis for his family. And now let's look. So that's Ho over there. This is a picture taken, I think, probably. I should be able to tell based on the age. It's probably early 60s, so a little bit after this period. But that's his elderly mother in the middle. And so when he prepares his diary for publication, he annotates it. And we don't know when he annotated, the kids probably do. I don't know when he annotated. But here's what he writes about his diary entry in 1954. Right? And he's basically saying, of course, that the effect of liberation is not socialist utopia, is not a transformation in inequality, is not the dawning of collectivization. Rather, it is the resolution of this crisis of precarity. It looks like the old pattern of the household cycle that I talked about 15 minutes or so ago was broken. Doesn't necessarily mean that socialism is the answer. It doesn't necessarily mean that he thought socialism was the answer. Obviously, huge implications for the legitimacy of the communist revolution and liberation. That's why I make my point about historical nihilism. One quick last impact, one quick last comment on the conventional periodization, and then I'll wrap up. I'm just about at time. The Cultural Revolution. So the old story was, when I went to school, when we studied our first course in modern history, Cultural Revolution didn't happen in the villages. Right? Cultural Revolution is an urban phenomenon. The only way it mattered to the villages was the poor urban students, the sent down youth who had to go from Shanghai. They went up to the mountains. What did they go down to? Xiaxiang. They go down to the villages and up to the mountains. Thank you. That's the extent to which the Cultural Revolution is a story. So that view is changing. New book by Arthur sorry, not Arthur Waldron, by Walder. Getting old is so difficult. Andrew Walder talks about rural violence in the Cultural Revolution. The violence was, well, there was lots of violence, but it was unevenly distributed. What there was, which has not yet been sufficiently attended to, was a complex set of changes that profoundly affected communities and families. So back to Hoyong Lu's diary, and this is heartrending, an account of both the. So this nicely ties together, I think, my first story and this story, basically how the Cultural Revolution impacted education in this family and how the commune system affected education. Hoyong Lu's family, there's a happy ending to this story. Several of his children, actually, one joins the army, another is a worker peasant soldier later, and actually 3 or 4 of the 6 kids end up actually getting a university education, moving to the city, and so on. But the story, I think, is the story I really want to convey is how the disruption of education in the Cultural Revolution was tremendously consequential. We could tell the story in different ways, and if I had more time, I would. The agrarian radicalism of the period leads to an emphasis on lower levels of organization, the brigade and the production team, which actually sets the stage for the emergence of township village enterprises a decade later. The emphasis on self-reliance has a huge role to play in the Green Revolution in China. But the larger point I want to take away from this is that when we attend to these other temporalities, we see the Cultural Revolution not just as a political phenomenon, but as an economic, a social, and a technical one. The triptych approach writes out important continuities. It provides an incomplete account of human experience, and attending to other temporalities can actually help us better understand even that initial political narrative. I've already suggested some of the ways in which my approach, I think, helps us better evaluate political claims. By example, recasting the century of humiliation as actually the first phase in an overall convergence with global norms. A second theme that I think emerges from this is what we might call the persistence of the peasant condition. The extraction of resources from rural China has been part of China's economic story for the last 100 years. First, in the form of the agricultural surplus, then, more recently, in the form of the extraction of rural labor. There are some arguments that this continuity is finally shifting. We shall have to wait and see. Rural challenges, extraordinary rural challenges persist. You chose this room, but in another room at Penn, Scott Rozelle is speaking right now about the ways in which the education of rural children is stymied by malnourishment, anemia, and even basic health issues like intestinal parasites. Emily Hannum of Penn, of course, has also done work on this. And finally, there are some ways. Oh, sorry. So this is a classic statement of the peasant condition by the Dutch agronomist Jan van der Hoog, and I think this is a continuity that this was true of peasants 100 years ago, and it is true of peasants today. How does this matter for rural China in the future? I've already talked about the distinctive pattern of urbanization and de-ruralization. The major problems, even as identified by the Chinese government of the Chinese rural areas today, are, as I hope I've tried to, or as I have tried to convince you today, historically produced. All of this means that while China's modern rural history is in interesting ways convergent with global norms, it has also followed some quite distinctive pathways. And this has big implications for the China model, that is the degree to which China's experience can be informative for other societies. In any case, the main point that I will end on, I'm thinking through the approach, the benefits of attending to multiple temporalities. I hope I have persuaded you that at a minimum, they are useful for seeing this all very important subject in a new light. Thank you. It was on for the entire hour. That green light has just gone out.
Okay, well, so we have time for questions. I don't see anything online as of yet. So house is open. Chris Atwood, go ahead. Oh, here we go.
There you go.
Great, thank you. That was really exciting and really interesting. But I was astounded by a different slide than the one that you found so surprising. I'd like to go back to if you could get to the one where it shows GDP per capita and urbanization or rural percentage.
That should be right about.
Yeah, it's kind of near the beginning.
There we are.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So look at. I was so interested. It's so fascinating to see China. You see these basic three sorts of groups. We see quite rural and relatively poor countries. Then we have the very urban and very rich countries. And then you also have a group kind of in the middle, Russia, Brazil, Mexico. And then China is by GDP in that group, but it's so much lower. And what struck me as so interesting about that is, of course, because in some of those countries are ones that are in many ways were, their historical past were sort of Russia, it's also the great communist, now no longer communist, at least in economic, went through collectivization. Mexico also had its own sort of indigenous form of revolution, much more pluralistic, but it also had kind of they were kind of a collective, forms of collective. Brazil, but not revolutionary. But they're all very similar. But then China is so different. Why?
Okay, great question, and I have to give a little personal comment. First, I was talking. So my wife is an economic historian, and I was talking about this presentation with her, and she had all these questions about that slide. And I said, I got to tell you, nobody in this audience is going to ask me about Mexico. So, Chris, well done. You have defied my expectations. So the answer, I think, is simple. That despite all of these political differences, when GDP hits the lower end of middle income at the $5,000 US per capita or so, it is accompanied by rapid urbanization. And in China, that was suppressed by the household registration system and the hukou system, which of course is a great example, I'm only realizing now, is a great example of how the triptych doesn't work, because the household registration system is implemented in the early 1950s, is intensified in the aftermath of the Great Leap Forward to stop starving people from crowding into the cities, but is then maintained as a deliberate policy of managing welfare needs, so of drawing in rural labor into the cities to work without requiring cities to provide for the welfare needs of dependents. So I think, maybe I'm missing something, but I think that's actually the simple answer is politics, right? That cluster. And so what if you, I'm not, I guess I can't move too far, but let's see if this is that. Yeah, so I mean, so I think what the evidence would suggest is that you get this rapid burst of urbanization right around here, and then that doesn't change very much even as you go from a middle-income country to a high-income country. And it doesn't change if you stall out there either, as some of these countries have. But China, as you say, China is an outlier, and the reason is policy. And this is a great example of the point I'm making, because the policy is actually, so the hukou system is one way in which things don't really change after 1979. They change in one way, but not in another. Or did I answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, not to answer the question, but I mean, then in a sense, though, then the politics temporality, although not in the triptych sense, the politics temporality is making a big influence in people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's no way you could make an argument that said politics doesn't matter, right? I guess so this is actually very useful. So I guess I would respond in two ways. To understand how and why politics matters, it's useful to think in terms of these longer temporalities, because people respond to political change on understandings that don't immediately transform. So there's a lovely example of this in Hirschatter's Gender of Memory, where she points out that just because being labeled a landlord has enormous implications for your life. It doesn't transform your identity, at least not right away. So people continue to it's not quite it's a great case, but not, it's a great story, but not actually in the response to your comment. So politics clearly matters. If we want to understand how politics matters and why and how people respond to politics, we need to go beyond policy. That would be the main response, I think.
Okay, great. Any more? Yes.
Hi, my name is Jaja. My question is actually also as with one of the slides showing the number. I just wonder why did you use this, the census of 2010? So can we go back to the slides, yeah, like top of like 1900, and then you jumped to 2020 and yeah, 2010. So I wonder, because it's your first temporality is showing the long 20th century, and of course it's a follow-up of the 20th century. Does it like I understand you why is because it's 2010. There's a big like a sensor like so that's a kind of easy number to easy access to you. But why did you use like in the numbers in the late 90s? I feel like talking about in the recent 30 years, so China has gotten so much changes, and probably change our understanding of like 20th centuries going back to 1900 and 50s, 1970s, 1980s. And so I just wonder why uses that number instead of like 1990s or 1980s. Oh yeah.
Okay, thanks. It's a thought-provoking question. The simple answer was actually because I wanted to juxtapose. So imagine Yeah. Okay. So if we tell the story, so go back to my three picture panel, my triptych. If we tell the story like that, right, then China is entirely consistent with everywhere else, with lots of other developing countries in the world. If we look just at the third panel, which is this section, China looks extremely distinctive. This is the phase of, this is the genius of 改革开放, or of the early phases. We didn't know that 改革开放would lead to 中国崛起, but this is crucial. My point is, we know those two stories, but when we put those two stories together, it looks like something quite different. So I'm not discounting that story, but I think that you say, well, why didn't I tell the story from 1980 to 2020? Because that story's been told. What I'm interested in is what happens when we put those stories together. Fred, there's a question there.
I just have a quick question because I wonder, why did you pick Hoyong Lu as the example to generalize kind of the 40, 50 years like Chinese socioeconomic status? Because I feel like Shanxi isn't necessarily like the best example because China is like pretty big, and I would say that it could be very diverse and that generalization might be biased, and I wonder why you picked him.
Okay, so also a very interesting question that I struggle with a lot, and that's really actually why I am torn between these two historical approaches. So my 同学 Henrietta Harrison has actually now written, I think, a third book. No, I don't think the new book is about Shanxi, but she's written a bunch of books that are just about Shanxi, and she is very, very good at using an individual life to speak to broader themes. But I don't think that what she does is to generalize. And I don't think she would ever say that, what's the name of the first guy that she wrote about in The Man Awakened from Dreams? I don't think she would say that The Man Awakened from Dreams, this is an account based on a diary of a literatus who lived in Shanxi in the early 20th century, that she is generalizing his experience. Because of course, most people were not winners of exam degrees. He was a juren, he was not a normal person. What I think she would say is that his experiences can shed light on the broader experiences of China as a whole. She wrote a very short book. I'm going to write a longer book. Part of the reason it's going to be longer is discussing a little bit that variation. But at the extreme end, you could say the only kind of history is biography, right? All we can do is tell the story of individual lives. I think we would reject that position. The challenge, of course, is to use individual lives to speak to larger themes. And as I mentioned, I'm really torn because I would like to integrate these approaches. Your question suggests that I am not yet entirely successful, and so maybe I will have to write 2 books. Don't know.
Hi, Song 博士你好. So I have a really simple question, but it's not really a question about this particular slide. I'm not coming from a historical background. I do not study any historical, but as current pressure from urban cities are actually emerging, and a lot of people are trying to consider evading from those big cities to back to villages or less cities. Do you see there's going to be people are actually going back to the village areas? And if that's so, will that change some temporalities that you mentioned? For example, the local policies such like that.
So it's a great question. So as I think about the chapters of the book, I think I will write a final chapter in which one of the main characters will be Liu Ziqi, the blogger. It is Liu Zixi, right? Yeah, okay.
Right?
So this is this woman who dresses up in Hanfu. She's from Sichuan, I think, and like, you know, makes persimmon tea and stuff in the village, and she has tens upon thousands upon hundreds of billions of views. And she is, I think, a great example of this kind of romanticization and nostalgicization of the rural, which is definitely part of the 21st century story. She's a really good example because she's such a celebrity. But you're right. There are many millions of young Chinese people who are engaged in the new rural reconstruction. Who are. This is a movement that a scholar named Wen-hsiung has really energized. And I wouldn't, and where rural people, where basically urban kids go to the countryside to engage in development. And I don't think it's for the most part very effective, but I wouldn't challenge the impulse behind it. But to come back to, so the simple answer to your question is, it's a very interesting phenomenon. The core question is whether this is simply the last gasp of the rural or the beginnings of a new rural future. And I'm not sure of the answer to that question, but the answer to that question produces the answer to your question. My own suspicion is that this is simply a final gasp of energy before the collapse of traditional rural society. I can't see this being. There are such pressures for urbanization and all the host of changes that come with it that I don't see this back to the village movement as likely being historically a very significant movement. But as I say that, of course, I'm talking about what its historical, I'm talking about what the historical significance of something that hasn't happened yet is. So we should be cautious in making that judgment.
All right, thank you very much.
Why don't you go online, David? I mean, we have some more here, but shall we go take it?
Thank you for the lectures.
After this one, okay, go ahead.
It's very exciting project, it sounds to me. I am especially impressed by your argument that in communist China, the structure of family impacted the well-being. So, which means the number of working age people in a family is crucial for your income. I want to check with you, is it because, so before the communist China, the lack of working age labor could be compensated by hiring labor, but in communist China, there's like no commercial economy. So you have to earn the work credit for just having this working age people in the family. Am I correct?
So, is that just the prelude to your question?
No, it's just one of the questions.
Okay, so let me just quickly address that. So I didn't talk about the state, but I think you've nicely summed up one of the fundamental changes, which is obscured by looking at the triptych vision.
Mm-hmm.
One of the fundamental changes of 1949 is to basically rule out most of the survival strategies that rural people had developed over centuries, including hiring labor, but also, and very significantly, including mobility and migration. So the people in Hoyong Lu's village would go to Sichuan. When there was no food, they would go to Sichuan and get work. And 1949 made that impossible. When did they start doing that again? In the 1980s. This is one more way in which the Maoist period is really just an interruption. But yes, that is the basic argument.
Yeah, I think that's in conversation maybe with Philip Huang's involution and other.
So I hadn't thought about that. I will think about that. That's not where I came up with the idea, but it could be put in conversation with.
Yeah. So
sure.
My question is basically so you said this fundamental changes in surviving strategy also were like a major incentive to reproduction in China. So I wondered, are you going to make any comparison with pre-1949 and after 1980s in the model of population growth?
because we all know that in the 90s, when there was the one-child policy, the reproduction model changed dramatically. But so previously we did not think that much as about factors other than the policy. But I think your work provides a very interesting factor that is, having more children could be the survival strategy of the peasants, not only like patriotic. So my question is, are you going to make some comparison with, with this communist China, reproduction motivation with pre-1949 and after 1980s? And that's my question. Thank you.
Sure, it's a great question. So the simple answer is no, I'm not going to make any comparisons. What I am going to do is try, as I did today, to suggest surprising continuities and similarities. I mean, I guess, yes, that is a comparison. So let me tell you about this extraordinarily just heartbreaking letter that I read from in the archives from it's basically a man in the early 80s, so right when the one-child policy is at its strictest. And basically he's got a daughter who's disabled. And he's basically begging the higher levels to let him have another child, begging them. And the reason is not because of Confucianism and not because of son preference. The reason is because he doesn't know how he's going to live when he gets old, right? And in that sense, understanding the incentives that drive population in the family-centered incentives that drive population, that is a story that makes sense over the whole 20th century. So yes, I'll be telling that story, not so much as a comparison, but to suggest that there are these fascinating continuities. And then of course we get to the 21st century and we see income levels rising, education levels rising, investment in children rising, and the incentive to have more kids dropping quite naturally. Again, I make that point totally consistent with what we see in other parts of the world. So there's another story of potentially of global convergence interrupted by the particularities of policy.
Great. So we're sort of coming to time, but Yi wants to ask a question. So can we let her speak?
Hello?
There you go.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah.
See her, but
Sorry.
you can hear her.
Go ahead, E.
Oh, hi. Thank you, Professor. Sorry, I cannot attend today's insightful lectures in person, but your lecture is really exciting. I'm a history student, actually dealing with the rural China during the Maoist era. So my question is also relates to the documents of the Hoyong Lu's diary. My question is like, I see many biographies or diaries, sources like this, and they are very helpful, especially when we take the more and more sensitive archive research nowadays in China. I think that's a very valuable document. But could you talk a little bit about what are the pitfalls of such documents? Because I myself also dealing with such documents. So could you please talk about the advantages and the pitfalls of such documents? Thank you.
Thank you, E. It's easy to find my email address. Please send me an email and tell me more about your own work.
Thank you.
I will tell you a little bit about Hoyong Lu. So for about the first 6 months that I was working with the Ho materials, I actually worried that they were fake because they were just so perfect. Every important point I wanted to make, Hoyong Lu wrote something about. So I mean, some of the pitfalls are, and I should also stress that, as I said, I don't know if you were present at the beginning, that in some ways my approach here has been forced upon me by the pandemic. I would much prefer to be able to do the kind of triangulation that Chris was talking about, which is kind of that's kind of what kind of historian I am. And I would love to be able to cross-reference archival work with oral history work with documents like the diaries. I'm making do in a time when that's impossible. One of the things that makes Hoyong Lu's work so useful and I think also so reliable is that unlike most accounts by rural people, he left multiple accounts that were produced at different times. So in addition to the diary, he has written in the 1990s a family history. And he has kept notebooks throughout the period. And he also has collected all of the letters that went back and forth in the family. In particular, most rural people in China didn't write letters in the 1960s because they had no one to write letters to.
Right.
His son went off into the army and was stationed in Lanzhou. And so there are hundreds of letters going back and forth between Lujing, which is his village, and Lanzhou. And one of the great virtues of the multiple sources is that we can actually cross-reference them and check for accuracy. And so the notebooks tell us so the family history, which he wrote in his 70s, in the 1990s, tell us what he remembered in the 1970s. What he remembered in the 1990s. The diary tells us what he thought at the time. And there are interesting, if they were all exactly consistent, I would be very dubious. But it's actually the disparity that to me lends a kind of confirmation reliability. I'll give you just one example. In the early 1970s, his eldest son got a divorce. Very uncommon in rural China in the 1970s. They must have just hated each other. There's a diary entry about this.
Yeah.
In the family history, it's never mentioned.
Thank you.
To me,
please.
Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. Please continue.
So I simply want to say that this is a particular strategy that is possible in this case that gives me, I don't really care whether his son got divorced or not, but it gives me a greater confidence. Precisely the disparity between different versions of the history gives me confidence that I am getting access to real events. I really, really hope that I will be able at some point to go back and I can go to his town and get another level of confirmation through the oral history. So to come back to your initial question, the pitfall, of course, of these local documents is, this person here already raised the issue of generalizability. That's not a pitfall of these particular documents. That's true of any document. That's true of any, even an archive in Beijing may not be generalizable.
Right.
There are, but when we work with, I've forgotten his name, Jeremy Brown at Simon Fraser, and you probably know his work. The person who coined the term garbology.
The grassroots sources.
Who's that? What's that person's name?
Paris Elizabeth?
Well, no, Liz Perry wrote an article saying garbology is terrible. That was in response to some, anyways, so garbology is just like these found sources. And I think there's a real advantage to Ho's diary, which is that we can actually trace the story continuously. We have checks on accuracy.
Yeah.
It is sanitized, that's clear. So the establishment of the commune is not recorded in the diary. There is no doubt that that's because the kids didn't want it in published. I'm hoping that I can go and actually see the original diary. But these are some of the pitfalls and some of the strategies I'm developing to address them.
Thank you so much for your answer. I will definitely write your email to
Great. I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, E. And I think we're way beyond time. So I guess as host, I will take the liberty of calling our event to a close. But I do want to thank you, Dr. Szonyi, for a fascinating combination of longue durée history and microhistory using some amazing sources. Thank you so much for your sharing today. And thank you, audience, for coming, both here and at home. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.